Hello, fellow teachers. This is Teaching with Power. And in this video, I'll give you a way to teach the trial of Jesus before Pontius Pilate with more impact, relevancy, and power. As you watch, if you feel this video is helping you, I encourage you to hit the subscribe button down below, which will make the channel grow and help other teachers just like you. This is insight number 1 for the week of June 17th through June 23rd in the Come Follow Me manual, and I usually make about 2 to 3 videos per week. Pontius Pilate is such a fascinating case study, in my opinion, of what can happen when you compromise with the demands of evil. When you decide to give in to temptation or sin or peer pressure or whatever demands that evil might place on you. And interestingly enough, when you really examine the story, Pilate is not the villain that he's sometimes made out to be, but he certainly teaches a critical lesson about courage and compromise. So let's take a closer look at Pilate's interaction with Jesus and the Jewish leaders. To start, our icebreaker will just be a simple opinion question. No right or wrong answers, just let them share. And you can ask them, who do you feel holds the most responsibility for the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and why? Judas Iscariot? Pontius Pilate? The Jewish people? The Jewish leaders, the scribes and Pharisees? Or the Roman soldiers? And then just let them share. In my opinion, I lay the blame squarely at the feet of the Jewish leaders, but other opinions are available. And then you're going to transition with something like, what do you do when somebody puts pressure on you to do something you know is wrong? Today we'll take a look at the trial of Jesus before Pontius Pilate, the Roman leader over Jerusalem at the time. Pilate is going to show us what happens when you begin to compromise with evil or give in to its requests. Let's first take a look at how Pilate felt about Jesus. Then either you're going to assign 4 different people to look up the following references, or assign different sections of the class to look them up, and just ask them what they discovered. And they'll find that in Acts chapter 3, verse 13, Pilate was determined to let him go. In Matthew 27:18, Pilate knew that it was for envy that they had delivered him. In Matthew 27:19, Pilate's wife warns him and tells him, have nothing to do with this just man. And then Luke 23, verse 20, we find that he was willing to release Jesus. So Pilate did not want to crucify Jesus. He actually tries to save him from the Jews and let him go. And he tries at least 5 different attempts to save Jesus from death. And here you have one of the most ironic situations in all of Scripture. You'll remember that the Jews believed the Messiah would come to save them from the Romans. But here you have a Roman trying to save the Messiah from the Jews. Now that's irony. And let's examine how this went down. First, we know that the Jews want Jesus executed. But as they say to Pilate in John 18:31, it is not lawful for us to put any man to death. So Pilate sees him, and you have that great conversation between the two in John 18:33 through 37, which you may want to read to your listeners, but I'm going to forego it and just give you a summary. Pilate's biggest concern is to see if Jesus is a threat to Rome. The Jews are saying that he's claiming to be a king, so Pilate's questions deal mainly with that claim. But Jesus explains that his kingdom is not of this world, that he's really come to bear witness of the truth. And with that, Pilate realizes that Jesus really isn't a threat. So he goes back to the Jews and makes the most correct, accurate, legal decision ever made in history. And you can ask him, what was Pilate's verdict on Jesus in John 18:38? And the answer, I find in him no fault at all. And make sure your listeners understand that truer words were never spoken. Though Pilate didn't even realize it, he was perfectly describing Jesus. There was literally no fault in him. And that should have been the end of it. I find no fault in him, period. But then here you're going to say, unfortunately, what do you think is going to be the next word out of Pilate's mouth, without even looking? And I bet you they'll get it. It's but. Pilate is going to compromise with their request. He wants to appease them, so he's going to give in just a little. So ask in John 18:39 through 40, what was Pilate's first appeal to compromise with their evil desire? And the answer is he sees an out with a custom that they have at Passover, which was to release one prisoner to them. So he's basically saying, okay, you want me to condemn this man? I'll condemn him. But then I'll just release him again. And that should satisfy you, right? You're getting a little bit of what you want, and I can still get what I want. I can release him. And does it work? No, the Jewish leaders convinced the people to cry out for Barabbas, which in John it only says he's a robber, but he's much more of a serious criminal than that. In Mark 15:7, we find out that he is in prison for sedition and murder. So he's a terrorist of sorts. And once again, we have a case of irony that instead of requesting Jesus, the giver of life, the living bread, the living water, they request Barabbas, a taker of life. So it doesn't work. And now they demand a sentence. So Pilate's going to make a second appeal and compromise. So ask your listeners, what does he decide to do to Jesus in John 19:1? Or you could also send them to Luke 23:22. It's worded a little better there, but you could have them go to either. But they'll find that Pilate decides to have him scourged or whipped. And that's where we get that heartbreaking scene of the soldiers mocking him and putting a robe on him and a crown of thorns on his head and then whipping him. Then look what Pilate does next. Realizing that Jesus would have looked terrible at this point with what happened in Gethsemane and then being beaten at Caiaphas' palace, the crown of thorns, the whipping. Have somebody read John 19:4-5 and ask, here's Pilate's third appeal. And what do you think Pilate is hoping by doing this? He says, behold the man. And I feel he's appealing to their sense of pity or compassion, saying, just look at him. Look what we've done to this innocent man. Isn't it enough? But what happens when we compromise with evil? It's never satisfied. It just whets their appetite for more. So look at verse 6. When the chief priests saw him, they cried out, saying, crucify him, crucify him. And here, as the teacher, I would just lead them through this next section, reading the following verses and commenting on them, it's okay sometimes. You don't have to ask questions for every section. Sometimes, for time's sake, you just teach. So the Jews say in verse 7, we have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he was the more afraid. He's like, oh my goodness, maybe there's more to this. He's saying he's the Son of God? So he brings him back in and asks him some more questions. Jesus doesn't give him very much. But at one point, Jesus does say in verse 11, thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore, he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. So interesting. It's almost as if Jesus is comforting Pilate in a way. Perhaps he sees the struggle within him and tells him that the Jewish leaders are really mostly to blame here. And after that, it says Pilate sought to release him. But as he tries to convince them to let Jesus go, the people make a bit of a threat to Pilate. If thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. And that's not really an idle threat. The Caesar at this time is Tiberius. And near the end of his reign, he got really, really paranoid, and he was executing lots of senators for treason. So Pilate's feeling the pressure. He's let this thing get out of hand. So he tries another appeal, an appeal to their sense of national pride, perhaps, with, behold your king. Shall I crucify your king? To which they respond, we have no king but Caesar. And truly, they've chosen an earthly king rather than their heavenly king. So Pilate makes one final appeal. And we only find this in the account in Matthew. Here you're going to say, in Matthew 27:24-25, what is Pilate's final appeal to the Jews? And it's that he washes his hands in front of them, saying that he's innocent of the shedding of Jesus' blood, which is actually a Jewish custom. He's appealing to their law. You can read about it in Deuteronomy 21 if you want. He's saying that he is not accepting responsibility for Jesus' death. Or in other words, Rome is not executing this man. You are. To which they respond, his blood be upon us and our children. We take responsibility. And so he allows them to do it. Evil wins. The only stand that Pilate makes in this whole story, the only time he actually shows some backbone, is when he makes the sign. He writes, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And the leaders, they want him to change it to read that he claimed he was a king. But Pilate says in John 19:22, what I have written, I have written. He holds his ground. But by then, it's too little too late. Jesus is going to be crucified. Here, send your listeners to one final verse. What was Pilate's major problem in all of this, according to Mark 15:15? And his problem? He was willing to content the people. So, ask your listeners, what have we just learned about compromising with evil or giving in to evil? And listen to their answers. But I think the point could be made that when courage is needed, compromise will never be sufficient. Or, if I compromise with evil, it will demand more and more until it overcomes me. Now, our goal is always to liken the Scriptures, to make them relevant to our listeners. Now, we're probably never going to be tempted to have somebody killed, hopefully. But we can certainly relate to Pilate in that we all face situations where we feel pressure to do things that we know are wrong. So you could ask them, have you ever felt pressure from others to do something you know is wrong? And to help them make that leap, you could maybe give them some examples like the pressure to be dishonest or to cheat or steal, pressure to engage in some form of inappropriate entertainment, a movie, a music, pornographic material, the pressure to use bad language or to dress immodestly, the pressure to conform to the opinions, policies, and attitudes of the world, pressure to gossip about other people or to put other people down, or maybe even pressure in a relationship to push the boundaries of morality. And then ask them, can you learn from Pilate's mistake? What should you do when confronted with that pressure? And I think they'll give you some great answers to that. But hopefully they make the point that we need to have courage to make a stand right at the beginning, to not give in even a little bit, to not be willing to content the people. As soon as we compromise with that pressure, it will only mount and get harder and harder to resist. It's just going to keep pushing you further and further and further until you end up doing something that you never intended to do. And I suggest that you be prepared to share a story of a time when you resisted that pressure. Don't share an example of a failure in this regard, but a victory. Inspire them. I'm sure you all have times when you've had the courage to resist the pressure of the world and choose the right. For me, I'd probably tell the story where in high school, the teacher left the computer lab and a student accessed pornography on his screen, and kids were gathering around the computer to see it. And I decided that that wasn't for me. They invited me over, but I stayed at my desk. I felt the pressure and was one of the only students refusing to look. But I'm so glad that I did, that I had the courage to stand up to the pressure and not give in. I'm sure you all have a story that you could tell, or you could encourage one of them to relate a time when they stood up for what was right, when they had the courage to resist the pressure. And then conclude with something like, the next time you find yourself in a situation like this, when the world is shouting at you to compromise, when temptation is calling out to you to give in, even just a little, remember Pilate's problem and have the courage to stand for the right. All right, teachers, if you like this video, be sure to check out my other video for this week on the crucifixion. I hope this has helped you to be confident and excited to teach this portion of the Scriptures. If it has, please like, subscribe, share with other people, and if you have any feedback for me or additional insights, please leave it in the comments below. I hope that you can take something from here, make it your own, and teach with power. Thanks for watching.